Good afternoon and welcome to this Student Hub Live event. It is a round-table discussion from the Open University Business School, and we'll be talking about globalisation, technology in business and society. My name's Karen Foley and I'll be hosting this session, and we'd like to welcome colleagues from all around the world and all around the country. It is a live interactive session, so whilst we have a panel of 5 academics from a range of universities and the Open University, this is your opportunity to engage in dialogue about how globalisation and technological changes impact you and your business. So how do you get involved? Well, we have a chat function which is in the stadium view of the interface, and we've just played a quick video about how all of that works. Now, if you're watching us through that mechanism, you'll be able to chat and see our interactive voting tools. You'll be able to tell us where you are, whether you've been to one of these events before, whether you're an Open University student or alumni or other member of the public, and everyone is welcome at this event. All of the chat will be fed in from our hot desk from Zach, who I'll introduce you to in a minute. But if you're not at that interface, you might be in the live stream interface. And again, there is a chat function there. You do need to sign up for a live stream account, which basically involves an email, and then you'll be able to chat also. There is also a Twitter feed that we monitor throughout the event, and the hashtag for that is StudentHubLive17. And you can let us know any questions, any thoughts you have through the chat in the live stream or stadium or through Twitter. So I'd like to welcome Zach to the studio today, who will be your face and voices within our online discussion. Zach, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Great to be here, and got some good chat on the chat rooms at the moment, which is good to see. Loads of people looking forward to today's discussion. Terry wrote on Twitter, looking forward to a spot of global conversation today, so looking forward to it.
Excellent. Thank you, Zach. Now, for those of you who are able to interact with the widgets, you can tell us where you are. And by doing that, you just select on the interactive tool that you'd like to give us your answer to. So when there are 3 things, we need you to enter 3 things. So we've said, for example, town, city and country. So if you could fill those in with 3 things, if you can only think of 1 or 2 in any of those instances, because they're all fairly similar sort of layouts, you just need to put a full stop in there so that your results will send. Now, let me tell you what's in store for you today. We have a 2-hour event this afternoon, and we're going to have 4 sessions. We're going to take a look at various aspects about globalisation and technology. In the first one, we're going to have an introduction to globalisation and the impact of communication technologies. And I'll be joined by Ian Wairua, Mark Fenton-O'Creevy and Wifred Manuela Jr for that discussion. We're then at 1:30 Greenwich Mean Time going to take a look at the impact of mobile phones for learning and communication in Africa. And leading that panel will be Ian Wairua, and we'll be joined by Devendra Kudwani and Mark Fenton-O'Creevy. Then we're going to look more at the Asian countries, and Wifred Manuela Jr will be joined by Devendra Kudwani and Peter Bloom to discuss that. And finally, we're going to look at future trends in technology and their impact on global economy. So a lot of interesting topics and discussions there. If the chat is going too quickly, you can always select the little pin at the top right hand of the screen, and that will slow it down. And you can also adjust your layout to find a format that suits you. And there's a little button that you can press at the bottom of the screen, which will show you 3 sort of versions of the interface, basically making the chat or video larger or smaller to suit you. OK, so I think that's all the administration out of the way. And please do fill in the widgets to let us know where you are, how you're feeling in 3 words on this fine afternoon, whether or not you're an Open University student, and if you've been to one of our Student Hub Live events before. So we'll fill you in and add those later, and we'll have a lot more questions in our first session, which is going to come up in a few minutes after this quick slide. Right, welcome back. This session is going to be about an introduction to globalisation and the impact of communication technologies. We're going to look at the differences in business environments within Asia, Africa, the US and Europe, and then we're going to take a look at the roles of social media, big data and IT innovation. So lots there. We've got lots of questions to ask you at home as well. So you should see in your interface lots and lots of widgets or interactive tools that should have populated now. So you can have a look at those and fill in as much as you would like to, and also obviously put comments in the chat as well. So joining me is Mark Fenton-O'Creevy, who is Professor of Organisational Behaviour and Associate Dean, External Engagement at the Open University Faculty of Business and Law. Welcome, Mark. Now, you have a long-standing interest in comparative cross-national management practice. I mean, you've had a very various past, both in terms of the application and theoretical side of things as well, which will make this discussion incredibly interesting. Wifred Manuela Jr., you are joining us from the Asian Institute of Management in the Philippines, and you're involved in the design and delivery of economics and finance courses for the graduate degree programs over there at AIM. And you also teach business economics and corporate finance, and we'll be talking about your specific area and your research interests a bit later. And Ian Wairua is joining from Strathmore University, Nairobi in Kenya. And Ian is passionate about the learning experience for students in Africa through the use of innovative and emerging technology. So we'll be focusing a lot on technologies in that final session. And later we'll be joined by Devendra Kodwani and Peter Bloom. Right, so our first question, I guess if I can put to you, Mark, is what are some of the big business and management challenges that globalisation and the pace of technological change face us with?
I think, for me, one of the really important things to do with this is set it in a bit of a historical context, because neither globalisation nor the impact of technology on globalisation are new at all. In the video that's up on the site, and some people may have seen already, I talk a bit about previous waves of globalization, for example, the Roman Empire. And one of the technologies in that made a big difference to international trade was the invention of the Roman road. Later on, we saw other innovations, like, for example, the invention of ships with keels for the first time made it possible to sail against the wind and made different kinds of trade routes possible. So various kinds of technologies all through our history have been interwoven with the way in which trade has globalised. And sometimes there's been waves of significantly increasing global trade. Sometimes, as we saw during the period of the two world wars, you see great global trade taking a dive. But the most recent wave, so post Second World War, we've seen this exponential increase in globalisation, and it's been associated with new kinds of technologies. And some of that's been around increases in communication abilities, increasing in air travel, those kinds of things. But also, most recently, of course, most of us would immediately think of information technologies, and I think the older phrase, information and communication technology, is probably more useful here, because actually a lot of what they've enabled us to do is communicate more effectively over distances, as well as move around very large amounts of data. So it's made a massive difference to the way, for example, global supply chains can work. It's made a massive difference in the kinds of goods that we trade. So increasingly, there's massive businesses that are founded on information goods of various kinds. So if you look at the success of organisations like Facebook, like Google, and so on, what are they trading? They're in a sense they're trading in bits of data, although the meaning that we make out of that data is really important. Now, it's clear that there have been some very significant benefits from globalisation. So net wealth around the world has increased as a result. The difference in wealth between richer and poorer nations has also decreased, and that's got to be a good thing. But at the same time, it's brought about massive increases in inequality, including within nations. And we're seeing, some of the social problems we see around the world at the moment, and indeed some of the political phenomena, are to do with sort of backlash against that inequality-producing nature of globalisation. And during the course of the various sessions today, I think we'll spend quite a lot of time talking about, the balance between market forces, regulation, what is good governance, what is poor governance, how do those things affect the impacts of both technology and various forms of globalisation.
This whole idea of inequality is an interesting one, and we've been talking at quite a lot of length about the extent to which in Asia and in Africa there is a large amount of inequality, both within and between countries, depending on, of course, on what instances we're talking about and what impact that has. I wonder if you'd like to give it an Asian perspective in terms of, the sort of way that that's impacting on technology right now.
Well, in Asia, let's take a look at some countries that are in the advanced stages of economic development, like Japan and Singapore, and South Korea as well. So these countries actually have benefited more from globalization and advances in technology because they have the infrastructure that can actually capture the benefits of information technology, the information technology's impact on globalization. But poorer countries in South Asia and elsewhere would not have those infrastructure in place. So they don't benefit as much as these advanced economies. But just like Mark mentioned earlier, increases in incomes have come with globalization and IT revolution. So there really is some benefit also. But the benefit is not distributed equally among nations in Asia.
And what about you, Ian, from an African perspective?
Well, I think there are different ways of looking at the situation in Africa. And I think the first is that Africa has really been left behind in many ways. If you look at global trade, it contributes possibly less than 2% of global trade. But you have this huge continent, 20% of the world's land area, 1.2 billion people. And what is happening is that because of technology, you have a leapfrogging opportunity because especially of the mobile phone, which is suddenly opening up this huge continent. Now, the perspective will be that, first of all, there is still conversation about whether to talk about aid or trade, whether to develop aid or to develop trade to open out Africa, because these high levels of poverty, problems of health, and many other things, of poor governance. But I think the best way to see the interplay between trade and aid is, well, I think there is powerful imagery in what has happened in the last few weeks. You see the UK Minister for Trade, Lord Price, has paid an extensive visit to Africa. Just this week, the EU was having the trade talks with African countries in Abidjan. And if you look at that, it's about trade. And then the powerful image that emerges is at the beginning of last month, we had the UK Minister for Development Aid, Priti Patel, who just made it to Africa and then had to rush back to the UK and then left her job, of course, for different reasons. But you can see that perhaps what is winning now is the discussion on trade rather than aid.
Yeah, just to add to Ian's discussion, there has been a backlash on aid because it actually makes recipient countries dependent on other nations. So this dependency actually creates a negative impact on everybody. So that's why the focus now is more on trade, empowering countries to actually have more control on their economic development than just receiving handouts from more advanced economies.
Absolutely. I think when it comes to the global conversation on trade, I think it now centers on multilateral negotiations, on big negotiation bodies, and the sense is that Africa is being left behind. But in fact, what is going on is, if you look at Africa now, 43 countries are members of the WTO, and there is an increasing conversation even within the continent. And we now have the Continental Free Trade Area negotiation, which has just begun. The East African region has a free trade area, which at least has done the customs union and is still moving on slowly. What is going on is that big consciousness that wasn't there in previous decades, that Africa must play a central role in globalization.
Well, let's just take a quick minute because this is incredibly interesting, but I mustn't forget our online audience who have been telling us how they're feeling and have been feeding in some questions. We asked everyone how they were feeling right now, and I'll just show you the results from that. People are saying that they're feeling relaxed, interested, curious, impressed, challenged, receptive, well wrapped up. So some of our colleagues in the United Kingdom possibly, comfortable in their studies, good overall, uncaffeinated, out of my depth, alive, challenged, impressed, supported, representative. So that's all absolutely brilliant. If any of this is feeling out of your depth, I mean, we're going to be talking about a lot of issues, and ultimately it's this whole idea of globalisation and the impact to which, you know, one size doesn't necessarily fit all, and how that relates. So if this isn't your subject-specific area, I'm sure that there'll be plenty to talk about, in particular when we start talking about mobile phones and various uses of technologies that will be very familiar. So please stay with us and keep chatting. Zach, how's everything going?
Yeah, good. One of our computing students has a question for our guests. He wanted to know whether or not they see the decentralised currencies, such as Bitcoin, having a positive or negative effect on global economics and business, and that's from Davin Davies.
Interesting question.
I've got I'm an academic, so I'm not going to answer the question directly, but I'm going to get.
Very honest of you,
I'm going to get there. You know, so one of the things that we will end up talking about quite a lot, I think, is the tension between the free market operating in an unfettered way and what's needed for effective regulation in order to stop various forms of exploitation, criminality, corruption, and so on that can so easily become a side product of globalisation. And if you take the phenomenon of digital currencies, one of the key features of them is they're underpinned in a sense by a libertarian ideology. You know, that they are not controlled by government, they are not regulated, and that has a couple of results. One result is that because there's a real issue of trust in this new emerging form of technology, then it means that valuations are very, very volatile. But the other is that, in truth, they're being mostly used, the biggest use of them is to hide forms of criminality and corruption. So to what extent will they play a part in globalisation? One of my fears, I think, is that they will help support some of the dark side of globalisation. But when I talk about trust, there's a flip side to that, of course, because there's a sense in which these technologies, particularly the blockchain idea on which they're based, is all about trust. It's about a way of certifying that a transaction has taken place as claimed, and it's not dependent on any single certifying authority. It's a distributed approach, and that enables people to have a trust in the Bitcoin system, though they may not know an individual who's engaged in a transaction. They know through the network that multiple people in that network have certified that transaction has taken place, and those technologies, perhaps more so than the idea of digital currencies themselves, will have a profound impact. You know, even in my area of education, people are starting to talk about, can you use blockchain, for example, to ensure that when somebody claims that they've got a degree from a particular institution, that can be automatically validated in a highly trustworthy way. You can see how those approaches can be used in forms of commercial contracting and ensuring that even in very complex chains of transactions, that things that are being said have happened. So as a set of technologies that have an interesting approach to mediating trust, and all markets depend for their effectiveness on degrees of trust, then I think there are very interesting possibilities for the future.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for the moment, Zach? And can we remind everybody at home as well that there are lots of questions that we'd like your feedback on, either in the chat or you can vote on those. Some of the things that we're interested in asking you are about the extent to which you agree that there should be harmonisation of corporate governance practices globally. In your view, do you expect good corporate governance to have an impact on the financial performance of firms? What are some of the management and business challenges that globalisation globalisation and the pace of technological change face us with. So that's a word, I'll just put ideas in there. And I know a lot of people have been filling them in, but when you do fill them in, you'll of course be able to see what other people have said also. We've got a scale about as we become more globalised, are organisations over the world facing the same challenges and opportunities? What should firms be doing to understand futures? And this will be something that we'll come back to towards the end of today's session. And how should they be grappling with uncertainties about those futures? Some of the ethical, social challenges that globalisations and the pace of technological change face us with. So various aspects around this and what those implications are. It might be something that we haven't thought of that you can comment on in the chat as well. We'd also like to know whether or not you've lived or worked in one country, because sometimes this can influence our perspective on things as well. So it'd be very interesting to know that. And then perhaps if you have lived in different countries, how does living in another country affect your attitude towards globalisation? So please fill those questions in the chat and we'll be drawing those into our discussion. I mean, Mark, maybe if we could pick up there around this whole idea about, businesses are businesses around the world. So to what extent are they facing the same challenges and opportunities? How much is global, how much is local, and where is that sort of point in the middle mattering right now?
Yeah, so since the fall of the Soviet Union, it's been commonplace around the world, business people, economists, talkers, that to say things like, well, capitalism's triumphed. There is only one really viable economic model now, and it's capitalism. But there's a sense in which that's true. But there are remarkably different forms of capitalism around the world. So in countries like the UK and in the USA as the exemplar of this, there's a form of what could be described as liberal market capitalism, where a very high proportion of coordination between individuals and firms and other organisations is through markets, labour markets, markets for raising capital, stock markets, and so on. Even as close as a country to the UK as Germany, a very, very different model of capitalism, where you have much different forms of coordination between firms. So first of all, labour markets don't operate in the same way because there's much tighter regulation of the ability to hire and fire, for example. There's structures which require employee representative involvement in supervisory boards. There's cross-sector industry associations which jointly work together to set wage levels that kind of take wages out of competition between them. The banks are often holding multiple stakes in firms in the same sector, and also act as a kind of coordinating mechanism. Now, it is still a capitalist economy, but the sort of institutional structures of the economy are really quite different, and that leads to different results. It's a very successful economy, by the way. This is a country that's a lot smaller than either China or America, but depending on currency values at any one time, the annual value of their exports is often larger than either China or America. On the other hand, I've just mentioned China. Arguably, you could say that there's a kind of capitalism is growing up in China. The Chinese talk about markets with Chinese characteristics. And what you've got there is you've got a kind of central state-directed version of capitalism, but a lot of features in common. And in some ways, it's being very successful for the Chinese. In Asia, and Asia's not a single country, and there's a lot of variation country to country, but you talked, Wilfred, about the challenges of variations in infrastructure, and I think that's a very important inter-country difference. But another very important difference is around the ways in which cultures and social institutions work differently. So take, for example, how firms are financed. Again, UK, USA, a very common understanding of how firms are financed is through various forms of market mechanisms. Within Asian cultures, especially within sort of Chinese diaspora influenced countries, there's much greater reliance on social and family connections. This Chinese idea of huancai, which is a kind of social capital that you have with other people in your networks that enables you to draw on them for help, for support, for including pulling together money. And that's often a very quick and flexible way of raising sometimes really quite large sums of money.
Just a quick comment on what Mark mentioned about the Chinese way of financing businesses. Because in the Philippines, we have a sizable ethnic Chinese community, and they also do that among themselves. So the repayment percentage is very high because once you do not repay your borrowings from that group, you become a pariah. So they really have a way of controlling members within that group, this closely knit group of Chinese Filipino businessmen. So they lend among themselves and they also support one another's businesses. But the non-Chinese Filipinos would access intermediaries, banks usually, because capital markets in the Philippines are not yet that well developed. As Mark mentioned earlier, the English-speaking countries, especially UK and the US, they have a very transparent financial market. There is hardly any screen between dividing the company and the public.
I know, Mark, you want to feed in, and we've also got a question, and we're nearly out of time. So we'll try and get the points in, but then we're going to be talking very much specifically about how this impacts on Africa in a minute. Did you have something you wanted to add quickly?
No, I think I more or less that was a very useful answer. Just to say, I think that the easy assumption in the UK and the US is that other systems are somehow less advanced, and hence, if only that we get them to adopt the kind of capital markets we have in the UK and the USA, that things would be all right. But actually, that family network and Huaxi network system of raising capital within Chinese networks is remarkably efficient, and in some ways has some benefits over and above more market-mediated forms of raising capital, partly because of some of that trust taking transactions costs out of the process.
Returning to that idea about the Bitcoin and trust as well. Zach, let's just put that final question to our panel.
So quite a few discussions been sparked due to this. We've got one from John, which is probably more directed at yourself, Ian. And he assumed the percentage of trade in Africa measured by value of goods is measured by the value of goods rather than quantity. Unprocessed goods typically have a low markup. I've heard that if Africa processed its raw resources, it would capture more of a final markup. It's quite an in-depth and question there.
Might be one to bring into our next session, if that would be okay.
That'd be good.
Because if there are a few questions, we might just see what those are before we close.
Well, we've got one from Terry from Twitter, Terry O'Sullivan, who's enjoying the discussion so far. His question is about how business schools can best respond to the increasing automation of managerial work, and what should we be teaching our students now for the future?
Excellent. I know this is something we wanted to cover later, isn't it?
Oh, is it?
So, yes, we'll definitely reply to that one, Terry, a bit later. Perfect. Very good question. And finally?
Well, we got one from Atikula, who's been actually in the chat room since about 8:10 this morning. He's from Afghanistan signing in. So globalization, information and technology and social media, he recognises that they've improved people's lives around the world, but it has raised a big concern for privacy, and he wanted to find out, with such things as hostile competition, how can we protect our privacy, especially when it comes in the business kind of context, business privacy.
Excellent. Shall we pick this question up and we'll reserve the other two for the other sessions, and then we'll end this particular slot?
Yeah. So shall I start us off?
Yeah. Although we only have a few minutes,
Okay,
Mark.
so you're quite right.
We are over, but a very
let's do it
interesting
sound.
question. Thank you.
So we have become the product. So if you look at any free service that you're signing up for, Google, Facebook, and so on, why is it free? What's being sold? You are. It's the reason that companies can afford to invest these very large sums of money in free digital products for their audiences is because actually it's not so much about the provision of that free service as delivering you as a product and your information as a product. In this country, we're starting to see now these automated speech recognition systems that will be able to switch the lights on for you and so on. One of the other things they're doing is they're picking up all of your conversation and using that to better target advertising at you because they know what you're talking about.
And we'll be picking up on this in our final session about big data and artificial intelligence as well.